Everyone has dreams, right? Some dreams are memorable, okay? Some dreams you remember and you're like, I can tell you every detail. This last week, I had a dream. It was just, I just remembered all these details, and I don't know, exactly why I had that dream. I could identify a couple of reasons, a couple things about that dream. I'm like, okay, I know why I dreamt that particular thing, but most of it was just kind of a surreal, weird dream. I remember sitting with Kelly Monday morning, telling her about it. Must have been last Sunday night, and I just remember talking to her about, telling her all the details of this dream. I could remember that dream. Sometimes we have dreams and we don't really remember. There's just maybe some details, but we just can't quite place that dream, You ever had one of those? I remember one time I was talking with a guy and saying, remember when you told me such and such? And the guy looked at me like I was from Mars, like, what are you talking about? We haven't had that conversation. And I realized, what? I think I'm thinking of a dream. I was talking with you about this in a dream. We haven't really had that conversation. So some dreams are memorable, some dreams are forgettable, some dreams are happy, other dreams are scary. Some dreams take us to the land of Oz. Well, maybe not us, but they did for Dorothy, right? And but a lot of dreams take us to the land of insomnia. Have you ever been there? Ever had a dream that did that to you? This morning, as we continue our series called Daniel, a Prophetic Survey, we find that in Daniel chapter 2, the Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar had a recurring dream that ultimately robbed him of sleep, plaguing him with wakefulness and insomnia. And it almost plagued Daniel with the death sentence. But Daniel demonstrated a tremendous trust in the God of heaven. And that's what I want to challenge you with this morning, trusting in the God of heaven. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to Daniel chapter 2. And this morning we begin with the dream. That's point number 1, the dream. Look at verse 1. Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. All right, now before we get to the dream, the first thing I want you to notice is when this dream took place. It tells us right there in verse 1, right? In the what year? The second year, okay? So the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you're a student of the details, and I try to be a student of the details as much as I can, then you know that there's something that's not quite right. Because if you were here last week, you remember last week that Daniel and his 3 friends were brought to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar, and I mentioned at that point that Nebuchadnezzar was a new king. He had taken his army to Egypt. He fought the Battle of Carchemish and defeated Pharaoh Necho. And then he went north and besieged Jerusalem. And at that time, he took Daniel and his 3 friends out of Judah and into Babylon. So that would have been his first year. And then they put Daniel and his 3 friends through 3 years of a re-education process, or at least that's what they tried to do, to try to make Daniel no longer a Hebrew, but someone who was thoroughly Babylonian. That was their attempt. That's what they wanted to accomplish in those 3 years. But here we read that this happened in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, which then begs the question, how does that happen? How do we go from 3 years to now it's the second year? What's going on there? And what I want you to understand is that the Babylonians counted years differently than we might expect. If it was us in our culture counting the years, we'd say there was the first year, the second year, the third year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But that's not how the Babylonians did that. By the way, they counted the years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign the same way we count the years of someone's life, right? Just talking to someone this morning, they had birthdays. When a baby is born, what do we say that baby is? A newborn. We might count their life in weeks, 6 weeks old, maybe months. This child's 4 months old, 6 months old, 9 months old, right? We don't say that child is 1 until 1 year after its birth, right? And that seems normal to us. But that's exactly how they counted the years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as king. Now, in China, they don't do that. They do that differently. In China, a baby is 1 the day it's born. You say that baby is 1. And then when that baby has the 1 year anniversary of its birth, or their first birthday. They would actually say the first birthday was the day it was actually born. But when what we call the first birthday, they would say that baby now is 2. Okay, so they count birthdays a little bit differently in China. That's just a cultural thing. Well, the culture for Babylon, they counted the years of the king's reign differently than we would. They counted year 1 as the year of the ascension of the king. And so the year that Nebuchadnezzar is beaten up on Pharaoh Necho, and the year that he's going and besieging Jerusalem and taking Daniel and his 3 friends up to Babylon, that was during the year of ascension. So the first year of the quote-unquote re-education of Daniel and his 3 friends began in the year of ascension. And then 1 year later, then began year 1 of King Nebuchadnezzar. So that would have been the second year of their re-education. The next year would have been year 2, and that would have been the third year. So what happened? We can kind of put a timeline together that at the end of Daniel chapter 1, we know we've come to the end of those 3 years of re-education. So that means that the year of ascension has gone by, the first year has gone by, and now the second year is underway. And the 3 Daniel and his 3 friends come before Nebuchadnezzar. He's thoroughly impressed with them, says they're 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters. And shortly after that time, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. All right. Now, speaking of that dream, it's actually a recurring dream. We know that because if you look at verse 1, you see the word dreams. It's in the plural, and it's the same in verse 2. You'll read it in the plural. But by the time we get to verse 3, it's in the singular form. So what that tells us is that Nebuchadnezzar had a singular dream, but he had it over and over and over again. It was a recurring dream that he is having. And as we see, his spirit was troubled. He was not sleeping well at all. Who here ever has a hard time sleeping? Got it? We got quite a few people. You struggle sleeping, right? I never used to have a problem with sleeping. When I was younger, I could sleep, no problem. My head hit the pillow, I was asleep, and I could sleep till noon when I was really young, But it's not that way anymore. I've had trouble sleeping, getting good night's sleep, and it's been a few years now. Let me think. How long have I been the pastor here? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But seriously, as I get older, I find that it's harder for me to sleep. And sometimes I'll wake up 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I am just wide awake. Why does that happen? I've cut out caffeine. I don't drink caffeine in the evening anymore. I don't no more coffee. If I do, it's decaf, but I don't drink caffeinated soda. I mean, I've tried everything, and I cannot. Sometimes I just wake up in the middle of the night, and I am wide awake, and that can be infuriating, especially if I got a big day ahead of me. And it can be frustrating because you're tired and you've got a lot going on. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, he was getting infuriated. And we'll see that momentarily. Before we get to that, look at verses 2 through 11. It says, then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time. Would you underline that word time? Okay, we'll come back to that in a little bit. You're trying to gain time because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times, underline that word, until the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh." So here in these verses, we come to the demand. That's point number 2, the demand. That is the demand of Nebuchadnezzar for the magicians and the sorcerers and the enchanters and the Chaldeans. Let me just explain the Chaldeans, because if you're familiar with that term, you know Chaldeans describes a nationality or an ethnicity, and you kind of wonder, like, why are Chaldeans being lumped in with magicians and sorcerers and enchanters? And the reason for that is that at that time, Chaldeans sort of became synonymous with those who were like experts in the quote-unquote magic arts, okay? Not that we believe in that, but that's what people believed at that time, that Chaldeans were sort of the experts in that area, and that's why we read about them. But they're called in to reveal the content, not just the meaning or the interpretation of the dream, but Nebuchadnezzar wants them to reveal the content of this dream. Okay? He didn't just want them to interpret the meaning of the dream. First, he wanted them to tell them what was in the dream, what the content of the dream was. And some scholars have speculated, well, that's because he had one of those dreams where you can't remember all the details. Okay? I don't think that's the case. The evidence here would say that's not the case. It's a recurring dream. He's had it over and over again. We know that because it's dreams in verse 1. It's dreams in verse 2. And in verse 3, it's dream. It's a singular dream that he's having over and over again. We also know that his spirit is very troubled by this dream. So I don't think that's the issue. In fact, I think there's an even greater piece of evidence that would say it's not that he can't remember the dream. It's that he did not trust the magicians, the sorcerers, and the enchanters, the Chaldeans here. There was a trust issue. Let's talk about why Nebuchadnezzar did not trust the wise men. Why he did not trust the wise men. First of all, it would be pretty easy for them to kind of hear what was in the dream, the content of the dream, and then just sort of wax eloquent about that dream, right? And that's not hard to do. You hear something, if you've got any kind of imagination at all, you hear something and you can kind of say, oh, well, this is what that means, this is what that means. You can talk about it and so forth. And so a lot of scholars think that, that's the reason that he didn't trust the magicians and the enchanters, the sorcerers, was simply because, they could say anything. And probably would have, had you heard the content of the dream. And we won't even get to the content of the dream this morning. Well, Lord willing, we'll see that next week. But if you're familiar with the story, there's the big statue and the different medals in that statue, and so if they'd heard the content of this dream, they might have said something like, "Your dream simply means that you're a great king who has vanquished all your enemies," or maybe they might have said something like, "Your dream means that the sun will rise in your kingdom for many years. You'll live a long life. Those who rise against you will fall." I mean, that's kind of what a king wants to hear, right? And they know that. They know how to appease a king. They know how to make a king feel good about himself. And they know they could have done that. But Nebuchadnezzar did not want to hear any guesses about what his dream meant. He wanted to know the exact interpretation. He wanted to know that he could trust the interpretation of this dream. And he does not trust these men who he has with him in this meeting right now. If you look at verse 9, we know that he did not trust them to tell the truth. Let's look at the build up to verse 9. In verse 3, he reveals that he had this troubling dream. And in verse 4, they're like, well, just tell us the dream, and we'll give you the interpretation, no problem. And they didn't expect what he was going to say in verse 5 at all. He's like, you're going to have to tell me the content of the dream and then tell me the interpretation, or else. Or else what? Or else you die. Your houses are going to be demolished, so your family's going to be left homeless. I mean, this is a bad thing. But verse 6, though, there's the promise of great reward and honor if they can tell him the content of the dream and then interpret it for him. I don't know if they were more frightened by the threat in verse 5 or motivated by the offer in verse 6, but in verse 7, they doubled down on their request for the king to reveal the content of the dream. And in verse 8, he tells them to stop wasting time. I had to underline that word, and there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But he says, stop wasting time. Don't try to buy yourself more time right now. And he explains why he says that. He says, you're hoping that I'm going to get bored with this. You're hoping that I'm going to move on to something else and forget about this, and you'll be off the hook. And he's basically telling them that's not going to happen. So stop trying to stall for time. I want an answer. I want it now. And so verse 8, he assures them that he is not going to forget about this. And then in verse 9, he restates the threat to their lives. Remember, I said he's infuriated. This guy hasn't been sleeping well. He's exhausted. He's tired. He needs some good rest, but he's infuriated. He's not in a good frame of mind. So he restates the threat to their lives. And notice the second half of verse 9. The king accuses his magicians and sorcerers and enchanters of being liars. He didn't trust them. And that doesn't tell us why he didn't trust them, but we know for a fact that he did not trust these men. He tells them, stop trying to stall for time. Don't you lie to me. I know that's what you're going to do. I know that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to deceive me and lead me astray. Don't do it. Why, though? Why didn't he trust them? And I think the answer is something we saw last week. Remember last week, the end of chapter 1, verse 20. If you look back at that verse, that's when Daniel and his three friends first came before the king. And remember, the king was thoroughly impressed with them. And he said something really interesting in that verse. He said that they were 10 times better than who? 10 times better than the magicians and the enchanters. I wonder if it was at that moment that Nebuchadnezzar began to see that these enchanters, these magicians, these sorcerers were frauds. That he saw them for who they really were, as big fakes. And it's important at this point to reemphasize to you the importance, the absolute importance of integrity. Listen, friends, these magicians and enchanters and sorcerers were saying they were something that they were not, because none of that's real. And yes, I know there can be the element of the occult at work, and I understand that, but these men were not magicians, because that's not real. They weren't enchanters or sorcerers. None of that's real. So they were making claims. They were saying they were something that, quite frankly, they were not. They were lying. And Nebuchadnezzar saw right through it. He saw them for who they really were. It took meeting Daniel and his three friends to finally figure it out. He said, man, these guys are 10 times better than them. And he began to see these magicians for who they really were. Brothers and sisters, understand that Nebuchadnezzar was a worldly, sinful man. And he saw through the fraudulence of his lying advisors. And I mention that because the world in which we live today sees through us too when we are lacking in integrity. As followers of Jesus Christ, we should be trustworthy. You agree with that? We should be trustworthy. But trustworthiness demands integrity. Trustworthiness demands integrity. If we're going to represent Jesus Christ as his witnesses, as his ambassadors in this world, then we need to reflect his holiness. But we fail miserably at that if we're lacking in integrity. So as tax season is upon us, you say, well, wait a minute, April 15th was this last week. It's over, right? Not this year. They've given us a little extra time this year. So as tax season is upon us, can I ask you, do your tax returns, do they reflect a life of integrity? When you go to work, when you go to your place of employment, do you put in a full day's work for a full day's wage? When you're at the office, when you're at your place of employment, does your life reflect a life of integrity? Can people count on you to keep your word? Or do they have good cause to doubt your word? You know someone like that? You know someone that's like, this person said they would do this, they said they would be there, but you're kind of like, I don't know, I'm not going to be surprised if that doesn't happen. That should never be a way that people describe us as followers of Jesus Christ. Let us strive to be seen by people in our world as trustworthy people. Don't say something, don't describe yourself in a way that's just not true. Don't claim to be something that you're not. Don't say, I will do this, and then fail to do it. Follow through and be honest. Have that integrity. Nebuchadnezzar, he's looking at these magicians and say, we have all these abilities, and we can interpret your dreams. And Nebuchadnezzar probably believed them for a while, but then he met Daniel and his 3 friends. He said, wow, these guys are like 10 times better. And he began to see through the fraudulence of these magicians, and he didn't trust them anymore. So much so that even though he called them together, he said, I want you to meet. But he didn't trust them because he said, listen, I'm not going to tell you the content of the dream. I want you to tell me. Prove yourself right now. Prove that you have this ability, and then I'll believe your interpretation. And they're like, well, you have to tell us the content. And he said, you're lying to me. That's all you guys are, is big liar, liar, pants on fire. I don't think he said that, but you get the idea. I mean, he's like questioning their integrity. And at the very end of verse 9, the king says once again to these quote-unquote wise men, he says, tell me the dream. So let's talk about why Nebuchadnezzar needed to know the dream's meaning. Why is this such a big deal? I mean, dreams are just silly and meaningless, right? I never put a whole lot of stock in my dreams. I just think about it maybe, and maybe I don't even think about it, and I just go on with my day and whatever. But in ancient cultures, dreams were not viewed as silly and meaningless, especially the dreams of the kings. Okay? You remember, not that long ago, I was preaching through the end of Genesis, and remember Pharaoh had some dreams? Remember he dreamed about the fat cows and the skinny cows? Remember he dreamt about the plump grain and the blighted grain? And he was like, there's something about this dream. This means something. I don't know what it means, but this means something. And he had to get an answer. And that's how then entered Joseph into the story, and Joseph's life changed radically. But why was that such a big deal? Because in ancient cultures, they believed that dreams meant something. They believed that they were predictive or prophetic, especially the dream of the kings. And before you dismiss that, let me just point out that I've given you have 2 examples of the truth of that. God did give Pharaoh some dreams that turned out to be prophetic, and God used that. And now God is giving Nebuchadnezzar a dream. And it's not going to be the last time that that's going to happen in his life. And so there is something significant about these dreams. It is actually predictive. And Nebuchadnezzar, he wants to know exactly what this dream means, what it is predicting. Okay? The problem was the guys that he usually turned to for counsel in matters like this no longer had his confidence and trust because they could not reveal the content of the dream. He saw through their fraudulence. He saw them for what they were. They were liars. So let's talk about why the wise men could not meet the king's demand. In verse 10, they're like, hey, king, there's not a man on earth who can meet your demand. And by the way, they were right, were they not? That was absolutely accurate. They were sassy. That's what my mom would say. If I talked to my mom that way, she'd say, don't you talk back to me, don't you sass me. They were accurate. They probably deserved to have their mouths washed out with soap for talking to the king that way, but they were accurate. There's not a man alive that can do this. In verse 11, they confess that no one could reveal to the king except for, notice what they say, the gods, small g, and s on the end, so multiplicity of gods there, the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. And on that front, they were almost right. I mean, they're kind of headed in the right direction, right? Their problem was that they were relying on the multiplicity of pagan gods that the Babylonians had. And they're saying the gods, Only the gods can do this. And they were wrong in that because the small g gods, the multiplicity of Babylonian gods, could do absolutely nothing. You know why? Because they weren't real. All right. But they were sort of on that right track, and we'll see that here in a little bit. They believed, rather than in one God, the God of heaven, they believed in this multiplicity of false gods, and those gods were not real. So these quote-unquote wise men could not meet the king's demand because they were mere men and nothing more, and because their faith was in the false gods and not the living God of heaven. And with their admittance of failure and their inability to help the king, we come now to the decree. The decree, point number 3. Look at verses 12 through 16. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" It's an interesting word. We'll come back to that. Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a what? A time. Underline that. Appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. All right, so here the king's decree is pretty harsh, right? I mean, it's just, kill them all, Verse 12 says that he was angry and very furious. You think? That's kind of a clunky sentence construction. So I looked it up. I thought, well, let's just check the original language. And by the way, the original language, did you notice back in verse 4, did you notice that the wise men answered the king? It says in that verse, they answered him in what language? They answered him in Aramaic, it says, or Chaldean. And really, in the original, beginning with that verse 4, and going all the way through chapter 7, it is written in that language, in the Aramaic language. But I was able to, do some study. I've got some tools at my disposal. I was able to study the sentence structure there. And, it's basically, it reads something like, the king was enraged, very enraged. Just kind of kick it up a notch a little bit. I don't know if that's a better sentence construction, but it gives you a feel for the mindset of Nebuchadnezzar at this point. Remember, he hasn't been sleeping well. His spirit is troubled. He calls for this meeting already feeling like he can't trust the very ones he was summoning to the meeting. And now they basically tell him that he's out of line for demanding something that they can't do, and he just loses it. He gives the command for all the wise men of Babylon to be destroyed, and that included Daniel and his 3 friends, the very ones that Nebuchadnezzar was thoroughly impressed with and said they're 10 times better, and he gives this decree. I don't think he intended for that to happen. I don't think that was what he really wanted, but he wasn't thinking clearly because he had all this fury, all this anger built up. It was not fair. It was not proportionate to the magician's inability to help the king, or even to their calling the king out on his impossible demand. But it's what happened because Nebuchadnezzar was angry and very furious. In other words, he lost control of his emotions. Friends, uncontrolled anger can be so very dangerous. How many people here, show of hands, how many of you ever get angry? Yeah? Look at your neighbor and say, I get angry sometimes. Look again at your neighbor and say, but I'm not angry at you right now. Listen, anger is an emotion, okay? And an emotion, part of emotion is that's part of being created in the image of God, okay? That we feel the depth of emotion. And that's just part of who we are as image bearers of God. But anger is one that's kind of tricky. All right? It's one that we can lose control of that emotion very easily. Okay? And so the Bible gives us some instruction about how to handle anger. You're going to get angry. We live in a sinful world filled with sinful people who sometimes will irritate the daylights out of you. You know who you are. Wives, stop pointing at your husbands. That's not where I'm going with this, so don't do that. But listen, that's going to happen. That's the kind of world we live in. You're going to get angry, but you need to learn how to respond appropriately when you get angry. So I want to give you 4 keys to dealing in a biblically appropriate way with anger. You've got some spaces to fill in your bulletin there. Number 1, recognize your likelihood to sin if your anger is not handled correctly. Okay, recognize your likelihood to sin if your anger is not handled correctly. Remember I said that anger is a tricky emotion for us to handle because of sin. In Psalm 37, verse 8, we read this warning about anger. It says, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself. It tends only to evil. Okay, that anger tends toward evil. You know, it's very rare that we get angry and we do something righteous. It tends only toward evil, the psalmist says. That's why Paul told his readers in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, he told his readers, be angry. Be angry because that's part of who you are. You bear the image of God. Feeling the depth of emotion is part of that. Be angry and do not sin. Why did he say that? Because anger tends only to evil. Notice what else Paul wrote. He said, do not let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. That brings me to the second key to dealing biblically with anger, and that is, don't let the sun go down on your anger. In other words, address the issue as soon as possible, or ASAP. You can just fit in, or you can write there in the blank. Deal with the issue ASAP. Otherwise, you're going to give Satan a foothold in your life. If you're angry and you don't deal with it as soon as possible, then Satan is going to seize on that opportunity. Satan is going to get a foothold in your heart, and he's going to cause that anger to fester and grow and become something much, much worse, much uglier in your life. It's going to lead to bitterness. It's going to lead to contempt. It might even lead to hatred. It's probably going to lead to an explosive situation at some point. We need to make sure that we deal with the issue that leads to anger as soon as possible. And how do we do that? Well, number 3, go to the one who offended you directly and talk it out. Okay? That's the biblical thing to do. That's what Jesus instructed in Matthew 18, verse 5. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. Go to him alone, you and him alone, and deal with it. That's the biblical instruction. That's what our Lord teaches us to do. That's not the natural thing to do, is it, though? Human nature says this. It says, when someone sins against you, just let that anger grow. Just hold it inside and let it fester. Take your time to deal with it. And if you need to talk about it, go to someone else. And go talk about that person behind their back. And get other people angry at that person and cause division within the church. That's what human nature says. That's what Satan wants us to do. Jesus said, just go to the person. And talk it out and deal with it in the right way. It's not the easy thing to do, but it's the biblical thing to do. Number 4, forgive. Forgive. Guess what the blank is? Forgive. Okay? And I could have included that word 77 times or 70 times 7, right? Because that we know that's the biblical thing to do. When you're angry, you can hold on to your bitterness, or you can choose to extend mercy and grace to forgive. But you know that's the biblically appropriate response, right? Matthew 18, verses 21 and 22, Peter came to him, that is Jesus, said, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Peter thought he was doing a pretty good job there, didn't he? He was pretty proud of himself for that. 7 times. Yeah, how about that? And Jesus says to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. And the point that Peter is making here is stop keeping a running tally, Peter. Don't keep track. You just need to be merciful. You need to be forgiving. And don't be keeping track here. Forgive and don't stop forgiving. But of course, Nebuchadnezzar did not handle his anger in a biblically appropriate way. He handled it in a thoroughly sinful and wicked way, which should not surprise us because he was, in fact, a wicked sinner. In his sinful response, he ordered all the wise men of Babylon to be executed. He calls in Arioch, says, kill them all. Even those who weren't a part of this meeting today, Arioch might have asked, we don't really know, but he wants to know. The king responds, yes, kill them all. I don't think Nebuchadnezzar intended for Daniel and his 3 friends to be killed, but he's got this uncontrollable rage. He's lost control of his emotions, and he acts out in a way that was wrong. And so Daniel and his companions, they're included on this hit list. All right, and so these 4 Hebrew young men, their lives are at stake here. Thankfully, Daniel used prudence and discretion in his reply to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard. In verse 14, in verse 15, Arioch fills Daniel in as to why this decree was so urgent. Daniel asks, why is this so urgent? What's the big deal here? And he fills out. Arioch says, here's why it's such a big deal. And here's why it's so urgent. And what's interesting about that word urgency, if you remember going back, the wise men, the magicians, they asked Nebuchadnezzar, tell us the dream, tell us the content of the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar said, stop stalling for time. You're hoping that the times are going to change. You're hoping that I'm going to get over this and move on to other things. It's not going to happen. Stop stalling for time. There's an urgency about this. He wants to know, and he wants to know now. That's what Daniel's asking. Why is this so urgent? What's the big deal? And Arioch tells him, he fills him in. He says, well, the king had this dream, and no one can interpret it. And isn't that interesting? How God had prepared Daniel for this very moment. Look back at chapter 1, verse 17. In that verse, how had God uniquely prepared Daniel for this very moment? He not only had wisdom, but he had gifts, God-given gifts and abilities in terms of visions and dreams. Isn't that interesting? He's about to have his first vision, not his last. We're going to be lots of visions later on in Daniel, but he's about to have his first vision of the night, and then he's going to interpret the first of a couple of dreams in this book. God had uniquely prepared Daniel for this moment in time. Different story altogether, but you remember in Esther where Mordecai says to Esther, who knows but that you haven't been brought to this position for such a time as this. I think if Mordecai had been a part of the Daniel story, he might have said to Daniel, God has prepared you for such a time as this. God has uniquely prepared you and readied you for this moment. Friends, and let me just highlight it once again, young people. Do not ever underestimate how God has prepared you to serve him. There are going to be things in your life that you might think aren't that important, that aren't that significant, and God is going to use that in your life. Don't ever underestimate how God can use you and how he's preparing to use you if you would just submit to his leadership and lordship in your life. In verse 16, Daniel gets an appointment to see the king. Now, this is where it gets really, really kind of weird, doesn't it? Because he says he goes in, he goes in, in verse 16, Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint a what? A time. There's that word again. The magicians are trying to stall for time, and Nebuchadnezzar says, don't stall for time. It's not going to change. This isn't going to pass. There's an urgency here. Daniel goes and says, hey, is there a time I can meet with the king to interpret his dream? And they're like, yeah, there's an opening next Thursday at 4. We don't know what time it was, but we know he had time, right? We know he had at least one day. How can something be so incredibly urgent that Daniel comes and says, I think I can interpret this dream? And they're like, well, come back tomorrow. I mean, you notice that? So here it is. He makes this appointment, and that brings us now. And by the way, before I move on, just understand, Daniel at this point does not know the content of the dream. Okay? He's gifted in the interpretation of the dreams, but he doesn't yet know the content. And Nebuchadnezzar wants to know the content. Okay? So that brings us now to the dependence. That's point number 4. The dependence. That is the dependence upon God. Verses 17 through 24. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from who? From the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a what? In a vision of the night. What is Daniel gifted in? These visions. God's prepared him for this. All right? Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times. There's that word again. Underline it. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. So Daniel, having secured an appointment against everything that makes sense, because the king was like, I need to know this now. There's no time. Don't stall for time. Daniel comes and says, can I set up a time? Sure. Go ahead. We'll let you do that. And so Daniel goes home, and he goes to his 3 friends. In verse 17, notice that the 3 friends, they're known. Mostly they're remembered by us as who? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Or if you're, inclined to VeggieTales, Rack, Shack, and Benny. But we'll stick with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But they're known as that. But in verse 17, it's their Hebrew names that are listed. And I think that's significant because, excuse me, the 4 young men were about to call out to the God of Israel, to the God of heaven. In verse 18, Daniel tells them to seek mercy from the God of heaven. It would have been really easy for Daniel to just lean on his own strength, his own know-how. Remember last week we saw that God had gifted him in wisdom. He's got that, He could have been a little bit full of himself. He knew the dreams, the visions. He had this giftedness in that matter. He even had going for him when he met the king, King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was like thoroughly impressed. He did like 10 times better than magicians. I mean, Daniel had a lot going in his life that could have caused him to say, you know what? I got this. I've got this. I can handle this. But that's not what he did. Thankfully, he understood his dependency upon Almighty God, the God of heaven. And he said, we need to cry out for mercy to the God of heaven. And he makes it clear to his 3 friends that their lives were at stake. Their lives were at stake. Right? Arioch came and said, I got an order to put you to death. Their lives are at stake. And so a plea was made. A plea was made. With their very lives on the line, these 4 young men call out to the God of heaven in faith, and they seek his mercy. And friends, I cannot move on from this point right now. I can't move on from this verse before I explain to you that every human being today, is born in sin, and their very lives are threatened because of that sin. Because the Bible makes it clear that the wages of sin, the consequence of sin, is death. We are born in sin, and that sin separates us from God. And if nothing ever changes, that sin will separate us from God forever and ever in an awful place that the Bible describes as a lake of fire. Friends, we are born in sin, and our very lives are at stake. The good news is this. Because of Jesus and what he did for us when he died on the cross and rose from the dead 3 days later, things can in fact change for sinners. You see, Jesus is God's eternal Son who became a human being so that he's fully God and fully human. As God, his life was perfect with no sin. As a man, he could offer that perfection, that perfect life as payment for our sin when he died on the cross. And since he had no sin, and death is the wages of sin, death had no claim on him, it couldn't hold him, and he rose from the dead on the third day. He lives today to offer mercy to all who would seek it. Just as Daniel asked his 3 friends to seek God's mercy for salvation from the king's threat of death, I would like to invite you now. If you have never sought God's mercy before today, I invite you right now to seek his mercy. You can just call out to him and say, Jesus, I am a sinner. I deserve God's eternal wrath for my sin. But I call to you now in faith as I seek your mercy. Please save me from sin. Please rescue me from wrath. And listen, friends, if you have sought God's mercy today for the very first time, would you please let me know before you leave here this morning? If this is the day that you're like, and I'm doing it. I'm not going to depend on my good works. I'm not going to depend on my religion. Maybe you're here for the first time. You're like, I never heard this before. I didn't know about these things. But today I've heard, I know that I need God's mercy, and I've asked for God's mercy today. If that describes you, would you please let me know before you leave here this morning? If you're watching on the live stream right now, would you just leave a comment right now and say, Pastor Mike, today I sought God's mercy for my life. Daniel and his 3 friends sought God's mercy. They made their plea. And in verse 19, a prayer was answered. The quote-unquote wise men had told Nebuchadnezzar that what he demanded was impossible, and they were right, it was. But then God gave to Daniel the impossible answer to his prayer. Brothers and sisters, our God is the God of impossibilities. Amen? Is there anything too difficult for our God? Our God is higher. Our God is stronger. We sang that this morning, didn't we? There's nothing too difficult for our God. If you really believe that, then it ought to have an impact on how you pray. Because when you pray, you need to pray for and expect the impossible. And when he answers your prayers, you need to be ready with praise. At the end of verse 19 and through verses 20 through 23, we find that a praise was given. A praise was given. Daniel blessed the God of heaven. He recognized the almighty, awesome sovereignty of God over times and seasons. Nebuchadnezzar says, don't you stall for time. There is no time. I need to know right now. Daniel says, can I have some time? Sure. Take your time. Who's God? Who's in control of times and seasons? Our God is higher. He is greater. He is more awesome. We have a great God. He's the king. He's the God of not just times and seasons. He's the king who sets up kings and removes them. To all wisdom belongs to him, and therefore from him all wisdom is given. Daniel understood the wisdom that I've received, the abilities I've received, it's all from God. The end of verse 23, he not only gives praise, he also gives thanks to God, knowing that it was God who gave him wisdom in chapter 1, verse 17. And it was God who gave him understanding in all visions and dreams. So in verse 24, having trusted in God when faced with the unfairness and injustice of the king's decree, having received the answer to his prayer, and having given God the praise and thanks he deserved, Daniel goes to Arioch and says, don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king. I will interpret his dream. And Lord willing, we'll pick up the story there next week. I just ask you, is anyone here amazed at the prudence and discretion of this young man named Daniel? Verse 14. Are you amazed by the humility and the faith of this young man when life got really unfair in verse 18? Are you amazed at the heart of worship that this young man had in verses 19 through 23? Are you amazed by his courage in verse 24? He's probably still a teenager, maybe in his early 20s, but look what God was doing in his life. And I want to leave you with this encouragement, friends. God had uniquely prepared Daniel for this moment so that Daniel could engage the culture of his day. And the same God who did that for Daniel is still on his throne today. And he still is calling on his people, that's us, to engage our culture out there. And I promise you this, friends, he is uniquely preparing you. Young people, he is uniquely preparing you. If you would say, here I am. Use me, Lord. I trust in you. I trust in the God of heaven.